Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Belle Epoque Collection. Today is a special episode in light of the ANZAC Day celebrations. So I'm going to talk about some of the war artists we have in the collection, but also some of my ancestors who fought for our freedom. On the 25th of April 1915, the 1st Battalion entered ANZAC Cove at Gallipoli to a barrage of gunfire from the Turkish forces. The regiment was devastated, losing thousands of men in the first few days. As a result, the AIF began recruiting new infantry to compensate for the loss of soldiers. When the 1st Battalion was relocated to France in mid-1917, a new group of Australians arrived to be trained for battle. One was Sergeant George Hartley Brown, a 27-year-old commercial artist who enlisted in January 1917 to fight on the Western Front. On Your Hands, Down, produced in 1918 by Hartley Brown, is a humorous caricature of an Australian soldier completing rudimentary training drills on the Western Front. After training, Brown headed to the front line in the Battle of Bullecourt, then the Battle of Amiens in mid-1918, part of the 100 Days Offensive on the Western Front. Meanwhile, my great-grandfather, Sapper Frederick Stephen Baker, of the 7th Field Company Engineers, was also on the front line in Amiens. His background as a carpenter made him the perfect candidate for the Field Company Engineers, digging trenches and erecting infrastructure on the front line. He had taken part in the crucial Battle of Messines in June 1917, then the deadly Battle of Passchendaele in October, fighting directly opposite a young Adolf Hitler. Here he lost 80% of his platoon and he had been severely gassed by the Germans. Also in Amiens during the 100 Days Offensive was official Australian war artist Albert Henry Fullwood, attached to the 5th Division. Fullwood had enjoyed a fruitful career as a leading Australian impressionist associated with the Heidelberg School before deciding to enlist. His paintings were commissioned by the AIF to record the current situation and scenery from an Australian perspective. This is an original watercolour titled Bridge Street at Ham-sur-Her, near AIF headquarters, produced in December 1918. It shows AIF troops occupying the streets of the relatively undisturbed town in the final days of the war. This work was completed as a preliminary study for a watercolour of the same title, which now resides in the National War Memorial in Canberra, alongside several more examples. 20 years later and another world war begins. Australia is again summoned to fight for the British, and a whole new generation of young, naive men and women enlist, completely oblivious to the horrors of war. This time, Australia is under threat from a Japanese invasion. This sketch of ANZAC soldiers was completed by official Australian war artist Ralph Trafford Walker in 1943. Based predominantly in New Guinea, Walker used his background as a sculptor and painter to capture the Australian condition fighting the Japanese on paper and in sculpture. This piece portrays a group of new recruits preparing to sail to Southeast Asia to fight the Japanese invasion. Recruits like my pop, Trooper Frederick James Moore, who enlisted in 1942 and was sent to Borneo to liberate the airfields following the attacks on Pearl Harbor. He specialised in driving armoured vehicles. There he encountered horrendous conditions. The terrain was predominantly thick mud under constant rainfall, the tropical jungle was so dense, and the disease was rampant. Everyone who served there, including Pop, contracted malaria. As a tank driver, Pop was at the very front line, clearing the dense jungle for the infantry under a constant barrage of Japanese sniper fire. Cut off from the rest of the Japanese army, they dug themselves into the jungle, determined to die for their country. After some resistance, they occupied and repaired the airfield and waited for the invasion. Then, Hiroshima. Back in Australia, my grandmother, aircraftswoman Marjorie Joan Baker, was working as a telegraphist in the Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force. She transcribed messages to and from the front in Morse code for 3 years. In 1945, she was discharged on compassionate grounds and married flight engineer Neville Capel, my grandfather. Nev was Malay, and his family were caught up in the original Japanese invasion of Singapore, and his brother and father spent their war years incarcerated in the notorious Changi prison. When the war ended, Nev was offered a job as a flight engineer for Qantas in occupied Japan, and the newlyweds moved there in 1948. This atmospheric and bleak painting of post-war Tokyo was painted in 1949 by official Australian war artist George Garden Colville. The Scottish-born Impressionist was commissioned by the Australian War Memorial to paint a series of paintings for the permanent collection recording the aftermath of World War II in occupied Japan. This is the Tokyo my grandparents witnessed and lived in. I hope you've enjoyed the latest edition of the Belle Epoque Collection, and I hope you've learned something. But most importantly, I implore you to look into your family history, because these people are the reason why you are here today. Their struggles and their sacrifices should never be forgotten or taken for granted, and family is everything. I hope to see you next time. Take care.